Okay, so we're going to Bez Hashem look forward concluding this chapter, even though we relatively invested a lot of time in this chapter, even though it's relatively not a long Perek, not a long chapter yet. The enormous message which this becomes the central, ultimately ought to be the central message us as Yidden, or for that matter, the message to everyone, to perceive this reality. Everyone who has the ability to perceive this reality of Ein Eid Milvadei becomes the vital, the most critical message that we try to attain throughout our lifetime, is this notion that Ein Eid Milvadei, there isn't anything other than Hashem. It's not only that Hashem is in charge, but there's still other realities, which then it's harder to find the godly reality within, because we do identify, and as we can identify with this other reality, so we admit that Hashem is in charge and Hashem's authority penetrates every detail, but still there are details and there is another reality. So it doesn't say Ein Eid Milvadei, there isn't anything other than Hashem. This chapter, as we elaborated much, we're not going to go into many details which we spoke about. We can see it in the previous classes, again in the site koshertube.com and with the text on tanyaonline.com. That of the novelty which is brought out in Perek Kaf Aleph over the previous chapter, whereby in the previous chapter the Alter Rebbe speaks about the minuteness of Olamis, because it was only created by Yud K, the Yud Nivra Olam. The Chazal tell us based on the pasuk B'Ko Hashem Tzur Ilavim, Hashem created the worlds Tzur, He created the worlds B'Ko, which is with the Chazal tell us, our sages tell us Yud Nivra Olam Haba and the Hey Nivra Olam Hazeh. With the Yud Hashem created the entire Olam Haba, and the entire Olam Hazeh was created with one Hey. And there the Alter Rebbe elaborates that even by man, what is one letter in comparison to his entire Nafshei HaMedaber, his ability to speak, and then his in comparison to his Machshav, and deeper within the Neshama, which points out almost that how little this letter, this one letter is, or insignificant this one letter is, and hence this which this letter produces. And in the context of God, the Eilamais which these two letters of Yud K produces in the chapter, but yet we still remain with the message that there's still two entities. There is a very small world, there's a world, or Elam Hazeh, Elam Haba, but ultimately remain very insignificant, very small, very minute, because you're dealing with the overwhelming reality of Hashem, but yet they still kind of exist. In the chapter 21, again based on the message of the chapter 20, this 20th chapter. In the 21st chapter, the Alter Rebbe reveals to us, or points out, that even after it exists, it remains a non-existent entity. Hence, Ein Eid Milvadei, there isn't anything other than Hashem. And again, this is based on what we say every single day in davening, that you are the same creator before, you are the same God prior to creation, you're the same God after creation. What the message is over here, that after Hashem created the world, aren't two entities, a world and Hashem which is in charge of the world. No. After Hashem creates the world, it remains solely Hashem, only Hashem, exactly the way it was prior to creation. You ask anybody, what was there prior to creation? Well, only God. What about the world? What did the world look there? There was no world. It was only God's reality present. And the message is that even after Hashem created the world, which might seem that there's another reality, another entity, Hashem is in charge, obviously He's God, but there's still another entity. So we say, Atahu lachash nivra, that you are the same God after you created the world. What does it mean, the same God? There are no two entities. But what about this energy which was invested? What about that little Yud? It's very little, and it's very small in comparison to God's ability to speak and express Himself and so on. It's just one us. Again, I'm just mentioning a few tidbits of the previous classes. It's still one us. It's still something, and hence the creation which came from this us, Elam Haba, or the Hey, one letter, this entire Elam Hazeh came about. Apparently it's still something, something very small, but still something. Here the Alter Rebbe introduces this, that by man, the difference, in other words, the way speech is by man, that even one word, even something very small left his mouth, you cannot put it back into the system, because you are separated from this which you spoke. You're separated from this which you have uttered. You're separated which this you have pronounced. You're separated from this which you have spoken. And I've mentioned many times people wish they could take that word and swallow it back into their system. But man cannot do it. Because man is limited. And once you speak, your speech goes out of your system. When it comes to Hashem, when He speaks there, you cannot never say that it left Hashem's system. Where did it go? The place where it went, that domain where that speech went. Isn't God with His entire presence there in that very place where that speech has gone? Obviously, there is no domain which is devoid of Hashem. So when Hashem speaks, even after He speaks, He remains in the domain of where He speaks. He is in that very domain. So it's the closest example which we could perceive, which gives us the ability to perceive this notion, this concept, is take that one word prior to man's verbally uttering that letter or that word. Where was that word? We gave an example, Baruch. When I say the word Baruch, it can never go back into my system once I left it, because I'm here, I'm in this place, the Baruch has left me, it's gone, it's left my system. But where was that Baruch prior to me pronouncing the word Baruch? It was within my system. Did you see it? Could anybody identify it? Nobody can identify it, because it is not a structured word. It's part of my system. Maybe my thought, but there you can't say it's mamish not, because somewhat there was the original formation of letters within Machshma Machshava. So it kind of was, to some degree. But if you take that word deeper, when these words were still in my midot shebelev, in my feelings, where otiyot do not exist, those words, that Baruch, that structured Baruch, Beis Reish Vav Ches Chaf, or Chaf Safit, or any other language Baruch would be spelled, was non-existent. And if you go even deeper within the person's soul, as was pointed out, in the person's Chabad, in this person's intellect, certainly otiyot do not exist. So where was it? It was not. And that we can carry over to God's expressing Himself even after. In other words, the reality, the way, the expression of God in the light of God's presence exists even after He uttered those words. The words which spoke, after He spoke creation into being, the words which created and remains the creation, the energy of creation. Even after He spoke it, because He is still in the domain, His whole presence, His feelings, His intellect is in the very domain of that speech. So that speech continues to remain swallowed, let's use that word, within His grand reality, in the reality where speech doesn't exist. So by man it leaves man, and it always becomes a separate entity. It's very small, because how could you compare one letter in comparison to the many millions and billions of words and letters that man could speak? It's very small, but it still is. It still exists. Because by man it leaves Him. By God nothing leaves God. God is everywhere. Ein lach da makim shechutz mimenu. So even when it is, it's truly not. So again, we elaborated on this point over here much in the previous classes, but we repeat it just to get the flow and to go on. So why is ultimately God's speech called dibur if ultimately it always remains within the system? The answer is only la mekablim. In other words, as we again pointed this out, speech is ultimately an expression after man takes his inner expressions, or his inner kochot, or this which would be conveyed or be expressed with his inner kochot, and contracts them and conceals them in profound energy till he's able to verbally express himself with particular words. In other words, once you see words in formation, this comes subsequent, or more so consequent, to man's contracting his inner feelings or his inner kochot, his inner talents. And we gave an example as well. When somebody is overwhelmed, he cannot speak, because what is on the surface, what is in full function, is his feelings or his intellect. It's like someone said, I was speechless. Why were you speechless? Why didn't you just say what you said 10 minutes later? It's because everything else was in function, so speech could not be in function. The mere reality of speech is a clear description or is a clear proof or demonstration would be the right word, is a clear demonstration that this expression comes after much contraction and much concealment of my inner kochot. In other words, the whole formation of speech comes through, as known the expression tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means contraction. I contract, I conceal, condense my inner kochot, bring them in, and that's the way I'm able to speak. That's the mere reality of speech is a demonstration of tzimtzum, man's contracting his inner kochot. And that's why speech could ultimately give over. One can give over a certain concept precisely through speech. And we gave the example, this great teacher, profound thinker, when he's charged with a mandate to teach a child which has no knowledge at all. He can't just sit in front of the child and beam his light to the child. The child will not understand. He has to condense his light and put it into words. Now, even words not always helps, because imagine if he would just learn that topic, may it be, let's say, a Torah topic, Gemara, the way he understands the Gemara, the child would also not pick up the message, pick up his teaching. So even within words, there's many other levels of contractions as well that you have to condense or contract the spirit of the message into different sayings and different phrases, or classically known the mashal, the parable, which the point of the parable is you remove the concept and you put it into a story, into an anecdote, and via the anecdote you try to transmit the message. So there's many levels of tzimtzumim, but the first and foremost tzimtzum, or a quantum leap step for man, whereby he's able to express himself. In other words, he's able to condense or able to transmit a message which is within him, or a particular knowledge or insight within him. A quantum leap step from him to the outside. In other words, in his ability to convey is via the koach of dibur, the koach of speech. Because speech, by definition, is an expression of his tzimtzum. That he's able to put everything on the side and find the right words in order to convey this which goes on, his message and his insights which he is trying to convey. But if he would just beam the message from himself without speech, try to skip over that means of speech, the recipient will never understand. It's too bright, it's too much, especially when you're dealing with a disciple. Especially when you're dealing with a child, again, which doesn't have any background, and you try to beam your energy to the child, it's just not going to work. You must put it into words. And if you speak the same language as the child then will start understanding what you're trying to convey. So the whole point of speech, by definition, by man, or a main point of speech by man, is that it gives the ability for the recipient to have a connection to you. As opposed to prior to speaking, no one knows what I'm thinking. And deeper that, no one knows what I feel, and no one knows what I understand. And I can't just beam my understanding to another person. It must go through speech. So speech, by definition, is the ability, is the conduit through which I could relate to another person. So he says over here that the only reason why Hashem, when we say Hashem created the world, because Hashem created the world with the Hey, with Yud and the Hey. Or, as we say, that Hashem created the world with the 10 sayings. What's the point of the sayings? What's the point of Dibur by Hashem if in the end of the day He remains in the place where He speaks, which consequently makes this which He speaks completely a non-existent entity, and He remains Eined Milvade Atahu Li'achash Nivra Ha'olam. So what's the Dibur all about by God? This is where we draw the similarity of man's speech to God's speech. Or deeper yet, as we mentioned over time, the reason why it exists by man is because ultimately everything evolves from God. But we see it evidently more by man, and we can relate to this phenomenon by man and apply it to God. And this is the similarity between man's speech and God's speech. Just like by man, speech is a way that the recipient could relate to me. Similarly, Hashem spoke creation into being, didn't think creation into being, didn't feel creation into being, because that would be too overwhelming. It would be too powerful. Creation would not be able to physically exist. Creation would not be able to virtually exist. Because God's light, we're talking about God, and as God is infinite. And everything in the face of infinity is automatically, and by definition, consumed. There's no finitude in the face of infinity. So Hashem had to condense His great light, and ultimately He expressed Himself through dibur, metaphorically speaking. Dibur, speech, which again, as we said, speech is a tzimtzum. Speech by definition is that tzimtzum, that concealment that I hold back, I contract my koach, and I put it in words for the recipient to relate to me. Similarly, when you're dealing by God, that's the only way that creation was able to come into being, because Hashem condensed and Hashem contracted His Eireh HaGadol, His great infinite light, and put it into words, into kaviyachol, finite words, in order that a finite world or worlds to be created. As we gave an example, one wants to benefit a great light. It's dark, and he knows there's a great light, a great shine, a great beam of light. If you're going to get too close to the light, you won't be able to appreciate the light. Maybe light, maybe warmth. If it's a bright shine, in other words, if the shine is overwhelmingly bright, even you're looking for light, you're looking to appreciate light, you will not appreciate it at all. You need to cover the light and cover one layer after another till it is filtered, and ultimately the light which comes following these cover-ups, these partitions which you put over the light, that light would ultimately penetrate through that you can appreciate. And one's going to say, well, I'm looking for light. What's the difference? Let me have more. No, it's more too much is no good. You won't be able to appreciate it. And similarly, warmth. The sun has to be very distant in order that we should appreciate the sun. The sun would get a little closer, everything is consumed into the heat of the sun. Similarly, you're dealing with God, which God is Ein Sof. So Hashem, that's why we say Asara Ma'amoris Nivra Ha'olam. The reason why Hashem expressed himself in Ma'amoris, because Ma'amoris by definition said that Hashem Tzimtzim Eireh HaGadol, He was mitzamtzem, He contracted His great light, and He put it into words in order there should be a finite world. Or anything, even the Eilam Esalyonim, even Eilam Haba, ultimately is a finite world. In comparison to the Ein Sof, it's certainly a finite world. This world, Eilam Hazeh, certainly you see the finitude in the whole reality is made up of Zman and Mokim, the finite, the time, place, beginning, end, etc., etc. And everything of creation. The tree is that big and it's not bigger, it's not smaller, etc. Which would include the grand, complex realities of this Eilam or anything associated with Eilam. In the end, they're finite. How does something finite come from the Ein Sof HaBilti Bal Gvul of the infinite God? The answer, that's where Hashem used speech, which again, by definition, is associated with Tzimtzum. So that's what he says, that the whole speech, we're holding Ve'ein Shum Shinui, we're holding Ve'ein Shum Shinui, there's no change by HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ala Bruim, to created entities, which receive their energy from Hashem's speech, as it comes, as it emerges into a state of reality, is through creating the world, that he vests in them, to vivify them, to give them light, as again the chain of evolving of Hashem from a state of cause to the state of effect, which is generally, these are terms used as the hishtalshlus, is a term used of the evolving energy from koach from a God, rather the infinite God, ultimately to creating, to being the creator, and ultimately creating Olam is v'yidus hamadreges v'tzimtzumim ravim, and the descend of levels with many, many contractions, v'shainim, and multiple different types of contractions, ad yuchla bruim, till creation has the ability l'kabel chayusam, to receive their energy v'savusam, and their mere coming into being mimenu from Hashem v'leis batel b'mitzis klal, they would not be annulled in the face of this great infinite God. That's the only reason why it's called speech. And needless to mention, b'chol hatzimtzumim b'chinas hester panim, that the whole point of the Tzimtzum is to cover up Hashem's pnimiyut, Hashem's face, Hashem's infinite face, infinite reality, lahastir lahalima oir v'chayis, to cover up and to conceal the light and the energy and nimshach min diburi yizbarich, which manifests from Hashem's speech, leizgala b'chinas gilui rav, that it should not be it should not reveal itself with a great dosage of revelation, because that would be too much. Reality existent could not withstand too much revelation. It would just simply not exist. It would be consumed to this great infinite light. And that's the point that Hashem spoke. Again, jumping back to the example, if man will just sit in front of the student and start rethinking everything which he knows, the child will know nothing. He will come into the class the same way he left. He'll leave the class, the same way he came in. And if the master would start intellectualizing his profound knowledge, he would still not understand anything, or certainly not understand anything. Even with the greatest passion, he has to take it and put it into words in order to relate to the Talmud, to the disciple, to the pupil. This is the power of words, that it's able to take something profound and put it into, and condense it, and it's a condensement of the profundity of the concept as it's placed into structured, finite words. And that's the way the Talmud could perceive it. And the same thing with the way is God. The whole point of Dibur is, again, lahastiru lahalim, that it should not be gilui rav, much revelation, because then because then the tachtein, which means the inferior reality, which is this bria, the olam, would never be able to receive. Not this olam, not any other olam. And therefore, after Hashem uses a speech, one could make a mistake, that it appears that in the end this which Hashem created via speech is ultimately a separate entity from Hashem, because you don't see it as an extension of Hashem, because Hashem is infinite and Hashem is God, and ultimately when you look at the Olam, what do you see? You see an Olam. You see that something which came after many, because it came after so many tzimtzumim, so many contractions, which remove the Eirei Habilti Balbul of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which removes the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and hence creation comes into being. Then one looks at creation, well, this is a reality. And by man it is so, because once you spoke, those words become a separate entity of yourself. It's recorded, it's written down in history, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to, again, this is why it can appear, it seems when we look at Olam, that the Eir V'chayis Hadibur Shel Baruch Hu, we look at the light and the energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's speech, which is invested in Ki'ilu. We look at it like Davar Muvdal L'Mosiv Atzmusi Yisbarach, as it's separate from the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We try to equate God's speech the way speech emerges from man's soul. And we try to say it's the same way by God. And here is where there's the great grand difference between God speaking and man speaking. That man's speech, again, just is the culmination of the message, which we elaborated time and again, including in this class, that by man's speech, the speech becomes separate from man. When it comes to God, because God is in the same domain of his speech, hence the entire reality, the texture of reality, of Olamis, even though they appear to be mugbal, and they are to a great degree because they come out of Hashem's Dibur, but this Dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and consequently this with the Dibur created, is never separate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because Hashem is in Ein Ein Levade, because Hashem is in every Eles Asar Ponim Minei. There's no domain which is separate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or void, the void of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Hashem is ultimately in that very place which He speaks with His great, with all His infinity. We gave the example as well, before we culminate the final words over here, we gave the example that when a master, which was a very clear example to this idea, that when this great master, which we spoke about, when he's charged with this mandate to teach this child, so he has to remove all his knowledge to the side, or condense all his knowledge, express himself with certain words, and even those words he cannot just say what he knows, because again the student will still be lost. He has to use different layers within speech itself. He has to place many layers over this insight which he's ultimately trying to convey. And classically known, when he does the mashal, he gives an example, which the whole phenomenon of example is that you remove the insight and you place some similar, you present and you convey, or you present a story. Like the many stories we brought last week in the Medrash says many stories which tries to illustrate the state of Am Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu, there was this great king, he had a beloved minister, and he had people, and they sinned, and so on and so forth. All the many examples of the Medrash gives. And what's the point? The Medrash tries to make it alive, that we should be able to understand what really happened there. And similarly, when the master teaches his student a concept, he places it in a mashal. He uses a parable, he uses a metaphor, and for what reason? Because he tries to illustrate something which is attainable to the child's imagination, which is easily to be perceived and accepted and resonate in the child's imagination. But what's this point? Just to remain with the story? Not at all. This point is that he wants to convey the insight, but it's too profound, so he uses the story just as a conduit through which he's going to convey the insight. But when one comes into the room, which this great giant is teaching this student, and this giant starts telling the student a particular story, which in his mind again is a parable to the insight which he's trying to convey. Someone walks into the room. Oh, this great guy, this great prodigy, this great Eloi, this great giant of this great master became a storyteller. It's nonsense. The whole reason why he's saying the story is just because there's a disciple in front of him. There's somebody who wants to convey a message. He never became a storyteller. And into the child also, in the beginning he believes this man is a storyteller. He's telling me some interesting story. But as he progresses with his studies, he says, no, in every single anecdote there was a message. And eventually he realizes the insights which his master is trying to convey to him. But getting back to this which we're trying to mention over here through this mashal, is when you're dealing with the master, when the master says the story, for example. Let's say he's trying to illustrate the story of the Jews in the desert, or this many examples, parables which the Medrash gives, that there was once a king. You think the master, for a moment, when he says the words "there was once a king," he separates the mashal from the nimshal, the parable from the message, from the insight? When the master says the words "there was once a king," in his eyes, it initially refers to God, to the disciple, to the student. There's a clear separation. He doesn't know anything about God at this point. He hears a king he can imagine. So to him, he's hearing the word king. He doesn't know, he doesn't identify with any insight, any message. Conversely, when the master says, there was once a king, that God is right there at the center, right, left and center of these words, there was once a king. And he had a very special, important minister. But in the eyes of the student, he hears about a minister, which again he can appreciate and identify with. When the master says he had a very precious servant or a precious minister, he's right away identifying that with Moshe Rabbeinu. He means Moshe Rabbeinu for that matter. So to the student, which is listening, and to the master, which is conveying, there are two different perceptions of the concept, or two different approaches. And this is the same thing. God condensed His Eirei Abilti Balbul, His infinite light, just to relate or to create worlds which are finite, and eventually, for the reason why He created, in other words, for a special purpose for which He created this world. Then again, just jumping into that ultimate purpose, as we mentioned this multiple times, Nisav HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lis Le'dira B'Tachtonim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had a very strong desire that He should have a dwelling place B'Tachtonim, in this inferior reality. And that's the only way. And again, if Hashem would express Himself with His infinite light, there would never be Tachtonim, there would never be physical, finite worlds. So Hashem removes His great energy to create this Tachtonim, to create this physical world. And for that He has to use speech, Kaviyachol, which again, speech by definition is an expression of Tzimtzum. contraction of His great light? But do you think for a moment when Hashem speaks creation into being, He loses His infinity? Like the Master, when he says there was once a king, he doesn't does he lose the entire message that this king is referring to God? Again, using this example of the Medrash, not even for a moment. The Master never essentially became a storyteller. He just wants to pass and transmit his knowledge to this disciple. That's the sole purpose why he's using this metaphor or this story. But in every part of the story, he remains that great thinker and that profound master. And the same thing, while Hashem speaks creation into being, it seems that because a finite world was created, and therefore it seems to be separate from the infinity of Hashem. Again, not negating the idea that Hashem is in charge, but we're not dealing with Hashem being in charge of Olam. The question is, does Olam exist? From the perspective of God, it does not. From the perspective of the Master, it is nothing. He never became a storyteller. From our perspective, the other side of the coin, from the perspective of the child, whoever walked into this room, yes, he seems like it's a storyteller. Or in the eyes of the child, the Master is telling him a story. But Lagabe HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we finish over, we continue with the text, and we conclude the Perek. In this phase of Hashem, there is no condensement, there's no cover-up, and there's no concealment. Lefanov, for Hashem, which is the Master. Darkness remains like light. Like it says, darkness is in our face, it might be dark, which means we don't see the Ein Sof rather in this great light. But from the perspective of Hashem, there's no dark points. There's nothing dark. It's not a true essential concealment. Darkness is identified like light when it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And similar to the Master, there's nothing covered up. He didn't degrade in level. He never became a storyteller. There is no darkness. His mind remains the same bright understander of any concept. Again, he remains that great, profound thinker. It's not something which is essentially or truly separated from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. These great tzimtzumim, these concealments and these garments, these cover-ups, it's like that snail or the turtle. We give different examples, that it seems like its shell is so hard and solid, but it's mineu bay, it's part and parcel of the turtle or part and parcel of the snail. Because God, even though there is the two dimensions, the two names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, one expresses Hashem, the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, one demonstrates the Elikim, the Tzimtzum of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but what do we say? Hashem Hu HaElikim. The Master is the same Master as he said when he learns for himself, and the same Master as when he conveys the story to the recipient. Hashem, the infinite God, Hu HaElikim, he is the same God which is producing, expressing himself rather through tzimtzum. Like explained elsewhere, therefore, in front of God, everything remains insignificant, but not only insignificant, a truly non-existent entity. Not only a minute, a small entity, nor maybe insignificant, but a non-entity at all, based on this, which we mentioned again, based on this chapter, the 21st chapter, which the Alter Rebbe again makes it so clear of this what we just learned. And in the previous classes, it's not a matter of an insignificant entity; it's a non-entity at all. Hence, that the same God before Hashem created the world is only you. After Hashem created the world, there is only you. Ein Eid Milvadai.